Pope Francis has died after 12 years on the papal throne. He was the first Jesuit ever elected pope, the first from the Americas and the first non-European pope since Gregory III of Syria in 741. Pope Francis died the following morning, April 20, 2025 at 7:35 a.m. at his residence. He was 88. Now that the papal throne is vacant, what happens next? When a pope dies, his passing is confirmed by a doctor and a ceremonial Vatican official who calls out his baptismal name 3 times. The official will declare the pontiff dead and the papal office vacant. The world didn't react with chaos, but with a haunting silence. It was as if time stood still, not in reverence, but in anticipation. Inside the Vatican walls, something ancient had awakened. A ritual known only to the highest circle of the Catholic Church was already unfolding, one shrouded in secrecy, power, and centuries of unbroken tradition. As dawn broke over Rome, rays of golden light washed across the basilica's stone floors. But no sound echoed, no choir, no organ, just the soft, barely audible shuffle of black-robed cardinals arriving. Under the folds of white papal garments, the elderly pontiff had closed his eyes for the last time. But what truly ended? A papacy or a prophecy? His papal apartment was sealed with a crimson ribbon, an age-old symbol that the shepherd had departed, and the flock now stood unguarded. And yet, whispers already traveled through marbled corridors. Was this the Vatican's final passing of the torch, or the start of a reckoning hidden beneath centuries of sacred order? A conclave had begun, secretive, solemn, and beyond the reach of politics. From Buenos Aires to Bangalore, from Manila to Milan, 137 eligible cardinals began their silent march toward Rome, where destiny would be decided not by campaign, but by divine consensus. No press, no phones, no connection to the outside world. Only smoke, white or black, will tell us what fate has chosen. Behind those locked doors, alliances shift. Debts are remembered. Prayers are whispered with both fear and ambition. This is not just a vote. It is a spiritual battlefield. For in a world bleeding from division, war, and mistrust, the next pope could be the last spiritual giant to unite billions or the first to witness the Church's fracture from within. In the 1995-year history of the papacy, never has a transition of power held such global and spiritual tension. From whispered rumors in Vatican halls to ancient prophecies buried in forbidden archives, everything is being reopened. This is not merely a funeral. This is the beginning of a war of souls, or the rebirth of hope. And you may be watching the dawn of a new era, or the Vatican's final twilight. George Mario Bergoglio was born on December 17, 1936 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. His grandparents immigrated from northern Italy to escape the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini. George was the eldest of 5 children, born to accountant Mario José Bergoglio and homemaker Regina Maria Savori. They were raised in the lower middle-class neighborhood of Flores and were no strangers to poverty. He studied chemistry at secondary school while working as a bouncer and janitor. During his youth, Argentina was in the midst of political turmoil. Populist leader Juan Perón was re-elected in 1952. His beloved wife Eva died just after the inauguration. Perón was opposed by the church, military, and U.S. government, who staged a violent coup to remove him. But behind the quiet streets of Flores, something deeper stirred within young George. While other boys chased soccer balls, he was already observing the world like a scientist, calculating human nature, measuring silence, and sensing pain hidden behind smiles. By day, he balanced formulas in chemistry class. By night, he scrubbed floors in dimly lit halls. But no equation could explain the unrest in his heart, and no test tube could contain the pull of something far more spiritual. After graduating, George worked as a food scientist in a laboratory. He had great respect for his first boss, Esther Balestrino. His parents encouraged him to become a doctor. But one spring day, at age 19, he passed by a church and stepped inside. What happened next changed everything. He entered confession, with no grand expectations. But something in the priest's calm gaze, in the cadence of the absolution, cracked open a door inside him. And through that door flooded a sense of clarity he'd never felt before. He didn't hear angels. He didn't see light. But he walked out knowing he could no longer remain a scientist. He had to serve something greater than chemistry. He had to serve the soul. Yet even destiny is rarely without doubt. During his time in seminary, he developed a crush on a girl and questioned his path. But then, at 21, he fell gravely ill with pneumonia. He nearly died. A nun ensured he received antibiotics, and his companions at the seminary donated blood to save him. Multiple cysts and part of his right lung were removed. But he survived. That brush with death changed his perspective on life. Was the illness random? Or was it a divine pause, a sacred silence, forcing him to choose? He chose to stay, to breathe half a lung lighter, but a heart heavier with purpose. In that choice was born the priest who would one day become Pope. But back then, he was still just George. A young man who didn't yet know that by stepping into a confessional booth, he had already stepped into history. In 1960, George joined the Society of Jesus and took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuit order, was founded in 1540 by Spanish nobleman Ignatius of Loyola, with the blessing of Pope Paul III. It is one of many orders within the Catholic Church, and is primarily focused on education. The Jesuits place particular significance on poverty, chastity, and obedience, and a willingness for their members to go anywhere in the service of the Church, even living in extreme conditions. But to truly understand what this meant for Jorge, you have to see what he was walking into. This wasn't just an organization, it was a brotherhood of intellectual warriors, molded by discipline, sharpened by sacrifice, and sent to the darkest corners of the earth with only their faith as a weapon. From the 16th to 18th century, Jesuits established missions around the world and Christianized millions of native people. They have long been controversial and clashed with both secular governments and the larger Catholic Church. In 1759, the Church expelled Jesuits from many countries in Europe and their colonies. But in 1814, the Church lifted the oppression, and the Jesuit order continued to thrive. Still, no Jesuit had ever been elected Pope. George's training with the order was not just theological, it was psychological, emotional, and physical. They stripped away vanity, ego, even comfort. His mentors didn't teach him how to preach, they taught him how to endure, to wake up before sunrise and pray in silence, to sleep on stone, to study philosophy, not to argue, but to transform. And then came the vows. Poverty wasn't symbolic, it was literal. George gave up material possessions, lived in simple dorms, and often walked barefoot to teaching assignments. Obedience meant absolute loyalty, not just to the Church, but to a mission bigger than Rome: go anywhere, do anything, expect nothing. But it was the vow of chastity that quietly haunted him. His earlier crush had faded, but not the longing to love, to be loved. Still, he chose the path with fewer comforts and greater purpose. Jesuits were feared by kings, expelled by governments, and silenced by bishops. Yet they endured. Why? Because they were the Church's shock troops, sent not to maintain tradition, but to disrupt stagnation. And Jorge, bright, humble, fierce, was among the most promising. As the years passed, he taught literature and psychology in high schools. But his real lessons were not in books, they were in his ability to connect, to listen, to lead. In 1969, at the age of 33, he was ordained a priest. The Jesuit path forged him into something the Church rarely sees: a man of discipline without rigidity, of intellect without arrogance. And though no Jesuit had ever sat on the papal throne, the seeds had already been planted, and in time, those seeds would shake the foundations of Vatican City. Between 1974 and 1983, Argentina suffered through another era of violent political upheaval, known as the Dirty War. Dictator Jorge Videla directed death squads to hunt down political dissidents and anyone believed to be associated with socialism and left-wing Peronism. 30,000 people were killed or disappeared. The screams never made it to the news. Bodies vanished before dawn. And the church, supposed to be a voice for the voiceless, stood still. Among the silent clergy was a rising Jesuit named Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He wasn't complicit, but he wasn't defiant either. As a young priest, Jorge did not have the courage to speak against the dictatorship as others did. His involvement with the bloody regime was later scrutinized. And in that silence, questions took root. How do you weigh morality when speaking out means death not only for you, but for those around you? What does it mean to be holy in a time of horror? However, many reported that he refused to collaborate with Videla and helped people escape Argentina, even giving his own identity papers to a man who looked like him. But the line between myth and memory is thin. Some saw him as a quiet protector, risking his life in the shadows. Others saw a priest too cautious, too calculating. In 1980, George was named rector of the philosophical and theological faculty at his alma mater. There, behind thick stone walls, he trained seminarians and future priests. But the echo of military boots was never far from the campus gates. It said he helped shelter fugitives, that he whispered safe escape routes, that he used coded language in homilies. But no official record confirms it, only testimonies, fragments, stories told in hushed tones. And when the dictatorship finally fell, it didn't erase the weight of those years. It amplified them. Years later, Pope Francis would call the Church's behavior during that era a sin of omission. But at the time, few dared speak those words. This period left a scar on Bergoglio's soul, a lifelong wound that would later shape how he viewed power, humility, and the need for justice, not just mercy. In 2000, he spoke out against the Church's complacency during the Dirty War. Later, as president of the Argentine Episcopal Conference, he issued an apology for the Church's failure to protect people. It was an act of humility, but also of reckoning. He couldn't change the past, but he could illuminate it. Because to lead the Church is not only to carry its truths, but to face its shadows. In the silence of the Dirty War, Jorge made choices that would follow him to the papacy. Not loud choices, but deeply human ones. In 1997, Jorge was named Archbishop of Buenos Aires. He was deeply committed to social justice and serving the disenfranchised. He frequently took public transportation to visit poor people. Each Holy Thursday, he went to jails, hospitals, and retirement homes to wash people's feet. He doubled the number of priests assigned to work in shanty towns and became known as the Slum Bishop. George practiced what he preached. He lived in a small apartment, dressed simply, and cooked his own meals rather than taking up residence in an elegant bishop's palace. But that wasn't just a lifestyle choice. It was war against the hollow pride that had infected the Church. In the poorest neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, where tin roofs rattled with each gust of wind, and hope was a currency long spent, there walked a bishop who didn't wear gold or silk. He wore scuffed shoes, took the subway, sat in shacks where sewage ran through alleys, and children played beside broken glass. He restructured the archdiocese and criticized members of the Church who lived extravagantly. He even sold the archdiocese's bank shares and enforced stricter financial discipline. George didn't preach prosperity. He lived poverty. Each Holy Week, while others in the Church held grand processions, he disappeared into the shadows, kneeling before drug addicts, prisoners, the elderly forgotten in crumbling institutions. There, in silence, he washed their feet not as ceremony, but as confession. Not their confession his. It was as if he were cleansing the Church's arrogance, stroke by stroke, in every basin of water. In 2000, He spoke out against the church's complacency during the Dirty War. Later, as president of the Argentine Episcopal Conference, he issued an apology for the church's failure to protect people. That public apology wasn't just about politics. It was personal. The Slum bishop was haunted not by what he had done, but by what he hadn't done enough. People called him radical, others called him a saint. But George didn't care about labels. He cared about lives ignored, invisible, and discarded by a system too obsessed with marble altars and cardinal robes. He redirected church funds away from ceremonies and toward clinics. He replaced mahogany desks with folding tables. He told priests to stop hiding behind pulpits and start walking the streets. And slowly, the church in Argentina began to look less like an institution and more like a family. He made visits unannounced, showing up in alleyways and back doors, always listening more than speaking. He asked the poor what they needed, and when they said presents, he gave it. No entourage, no cameras, just him and a Bible held together by tape. George didn't want power, he wanted presence. And in every slum he entered, the message was clear: I see you. I will not look away. In 2001, Pope John Paul II named George a cardinal. In 2005, Pope John Paul II died. George attended his funeral and was considered one of the papabili, or likely cardinals, to be elected as the next pope. He participated in the secret conclave of cardinals, and it was later reported that he was the runner-up, but made an emotional plea asking his colleagues to vote for Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger instead in order to bring the conclave to a fast conclusion. Ratzinger was elected Pope Benedict XVI. But what really happened behind those locked doors of the Sistine Chapel has never been officially confirmed, and that's exactly what gives it power. Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio walked into the 2005 conclave already known as the Bishop of the Poor, a man who lived in a humble apartment and took public transit. But the men gathered in that room didn't just see humility, they saw potential. He was one of the few voices in the church who could command both respect and reverence across ideological lines. He could unify or divide. As ballots were cast and counted, whispers filled the air. Round by round, the numbers shifted. More and more cards bore the name Bergoglio. The silence in the chapel thickened. Eyes locked. Some smiled. Others furrowed brows. Was the church truly ready for a Latin American pope? A Jesuit pope? A reformer? Then, it said, George stood. Not to celebrate, but to decline. He reportedly asked the cardinals to vote for Ratzinger instead, urging unity and a swift end to the vote. Some say his voice trembled, others say it was calm as a prayer. But in that moment, he changed the future of the Catholic Church. He believed the Church was not ready for what he represented. And perhaps neither was he. Benedict XVI would reign for nearly 8 years, and focus on returning the Church to traditional values. He opposed same-sex marriage and condom use in areas of high HIV transmission. In 2013, Benedict made the shocking decision to step down because his advanced age was hindering his work. He was the first pope to resign since Gregory XII in 1415. But in 2005, no one could have imagined that the man who had once declined the throne would be summoned again, this time not by ballots alone, but by fate itself. Behind the walls of the Vatican, some cardinals wept that night. Others sighed in relief. But all of them knew they had seen something rare, a man who chose not to be pope, because he understood the weight of what it meant to wear the crown of Christ. What kind of man turns down the most powerful spiritual office on earth? A man who believes the papacy is not seized, but entrusted. And while Benedict began his reign in white robes, Jorge returned to Buenos Aires in silence, his name absent from headlines, his spirit heavy with what might have been. But the seeds had been planted. In every back alley chapel he visited afterward, in every prison where he knelt to wash the feet of criminals, in every whispered confession heard beneath flickering candles he carried that night with him. He had walked away not as pope, but as prophecy in waiting. Benedict XVI would reign for nearly 8 years and focus on returning the Church to traditional values. He opposed same-sex marriage and condom use in areas of high HIV transmission. In 2013, Benedict made the shocking decision to step down because his advanced age was hindering his work. He was the first pope to resign since Gregory XII in 1415. The news came not with fanfare, but with disbelief. At 11:46 a.m., February 11, 2013, the Vatican press room went silent as a single Latin sentence changed the course of modern church history. Pope Benedict XVI was resigning. Voluntarily. Peacefully. Unthinkably. Popes don't resign. They reign until death. That's the rule. The tradition. The symbolic anchor of divine duty. But Benedict, scholar of doctrine, broke it with a whisper. Some say it was exhaustion. Others whisper of scandal, internal wars, or secrets too heavy for a frail pontiff to carry. Whatever the truth, his decision triggered a spiritual shockwave that echoed across the globe from the halls of the Curia to the pews of the faithful. Benedict's papacy had been one of solemn conservatism. He wore embroidered vestments, resurrected the Latin Mass, and sought a return to purity in faith. But behind the lace and gold was a man growing smaller beneath the weight of crises. The Church was bleeding from scandal, particularly sexual abuse cases that spanned decades and continents. Critics accused Benedict of failing to respond swiftly or transparently. Then there was the financial chaos of the Vatican Bank, the infamous VatiLeaks exposing internal dysfunction and growing rifts between traditionalists and reformists. Benedict, a theologian by nature and temperament, found himself not in a study with books, but on a battlefield of faith, money, power, and politics. And so, after prayer and deep reflection, he shocked the world. I have come to the certainty that my strengths, due to an advanced age, are no longer suited to an adequate exercise of the Petrine ministry. No pope had spoken those words in over 600 years. It was as if the throne of St. Peter had, for one brief moment, admitted it was still occupied by a man, just a man. On February 28, 2013, at 8:00 p.m. sharp, Pope Benedict left the Vatican by helicopter. He waved from the window, pale, thin, but peaceful as the bells of St. Peter's rang not in mourning, but in uncertainty. He would live out his remaining years as Pope Emeritus, cloistered in a monastery within the Vatican gardens, silent as the Church turned a new page. But behind that silence, a great vacuum had opened. The Church no longer had a king in death, but a king in retreat. And into that vacuum would step a man the world had almost forgotten. The conclave that followed wouldn't just elect a new pope, it would elect a new path, a reformer, a Jesuit, a slum bishop. But at that moment, in 2013, no one yet knew his name. They only knew the throne was empty and heaven, for the first time in centuries, was waiting. After 2 days and 5 ballots, 76-year-old Cardinal George Mario Bergoglio's selection was announced. He was the first Jesuit ever elected pope, the first from the Americas, and the first non-European pope since Gregory III of Syria in 741. He was the first pope in history to take the name Francis, after Saint Francis of Assisi, a 13th-century friar who led a life of poverty as an itinerant preacher. The world had never seen a pope like him. When white smoke rose from the chimney of the Sistine Chapel on March 13, 2013, the crowd in St. Peter's Square erupted. But no one expected the name that followed, Habemus Papam Franciscum. A stunned silence followed the cheers. Bergoglio, the Argentine cardinal who shunned luxury and spoke softly. The man who had nearly vanished after the 2005 conclave. Francis's appearance on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica signaled a change in the papacy. Rather than donning a red-trimmed mozzetta and a gold cross as previous popes had done, he came out in a simple white cassock and the iron cross he had worn as archbishop. The symbolism was immediate and powerful. This was not a monarch. This was a shepherd. He didn't raise his arms. He bowed his head. And in that bow, the church bowed with him toward the margins, toward the forgotten, toward humility. His first acts were small, but seismic. He cancelled millions of euros in bonuses traditionally paid to employees and cardinals on the board of the Vatican Bank. He gave the money to charity instead. Francis chose not to live in the luxurious papal apartments of the Apostolic Palace. Instead, he took up residence at a Vatican guest house. He rode a Ford Focus. He carried his own bag. And in every step, he dismantled a little more of the untouchable image of papal royalty. On his first Holy Thursday, he went to a detention center in Rome and washed the feet of 12 juvenile offenders. 2 were Muslim, and 2 were female. His first Easter homily was a plea for world peace. But this humility was not weakness. It was strategy. Francis understood something his predecessors had missed. In a world burned out by politics and hypocrisy, authenticity was the only power that mattered. He made action on climate change, which disproportionately affects the poor, a focus of his papacy. He condemned climate change denial and criticized capitalism and consumerism. He was supportive of refugees and asked developed countries to welcome more immigrants. He took a permissive stance on divorce, made women full members of the Roman Curia, and called for better outreach to LGBTQ communities. He denounced the death penalty, abortion, and euthanasia. He spoke against the rise of right-wing populism. Francis didn't just preach radical mercy, he lived it. He wasn't afraid of controversy, because he wasn't trying to preserve power. He was trying to reclaim purpose. And for millions, that purpose felt like the gospel again. Francis was initially lenient on priests accused of sexual abuse. But in 2015 he visited Chile and was shocked at how few people came out to see him. He met with victims who questioned why he was believing the bishops instead of them. Francis apologized for his mistakes and for the mistakes of the church. He fired nearly all the bishops of Chile who had been sweeping abuse under the rug. He launched investigations which exposed and removed many abusers. The greatest crisis Francis would face as Pope wasn't political. It was moral. The Catholic Church, long seen as a sanctuary, had become a symbol of betrayal for many its most trusted shepherds revealed as wolves in disguise. When Francis ascended to the papacy, he inherited not just scandals, but silence. Generations of cover-ups, secret settlements, transferred predators, and shattered lives. And at first, he was hesitant. He defended bishops who claimed ignorance, relied too heavily on internal reviews, and called accusations slander without fully listening. It was a rare moment when the Pope who had embraced the poor turned his back on the wounded. Then came Chile. A papal visit meant to unify became a moment of reckoning. The crowds were sparse, the applause faint, the survivors loud. They held up photos of victims. They wept openly. And they asked the question no pope had dared answer: why do you believe them and not us? That moment pierced something deep in Francis. The optics were undeniable, but more importantly, so was the pain. He didn't deflect. He didn't double down. He apologized publicly, personally, repeatedly. Not just for the abusers, but for himself. He returned to Rome with resolve. He ordered a sweeping investigation into the Chilean episcopate and forced the resignation of nearly every bishop involved in the cover-ups. It was a seismic act, the first time in history a pope had removed an entire national episcopal body for its failure to protect children. And it didn't stop there. Francis empowered lay commissions to investigate abuse, something many in the Curia resisted. He pushed for global accountability, held bishops to stricter standards, and created new protocols for reporting and transparency. He also apologized for the Church's role in the genocide of Canadian Indigenous peoples. But the damage was already deep. No apology could undo decades of trauma. Francis knew he could not undo the past, but he could refuse to repeat it. In private, he met with survivors not with cameras, not with speeches, but with silence. Listening, weeping, praying, not as Pope, as a man, as a confessor. This wasn't political reform, it was penance. And though he may never fully heal the wound, he opened the wound to sunlight so that at last, it could begin to heal. During the COVID-19 outbreak, Francis canceled his regular audience at St. Peter's Square to keep crowds from spreading the virus. He called for Putin to stop attacking Ukraine and for Israel and Palestine to come to a two-state solution for peace. Francis has called several synods or councils of bishops and lay people to debate church doctrine, including synods on the family, on youth, and on the church in the Amazon region. When the world stopped, Francis stayed standing. As COVID-19 silenced cities, emptied churches, and filled hospitals, Francis emerged alone into a deserted state. Peter's Square rain soaking his white cassock, his voice echoing across an empty plaza. No crowd, no applause. Just a man and a prayer beneath a crucifix, scarred by centuries. He canceled his general audiences and public gatherings. He took no risk with the lives of the faithful. Instead, he led from silence. That silence grew louder when war returned to Europe. Francis condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, not with political slogans, but with moral gravity. In the name of God, stop this massacre. He urged diplomacy, peace, and humanitarian corridors. He refused to align with any military bloc, but made clear that civilian lives were sacred and untouchable. His stance drew both admiration and criticism. Some felt he should have named Putin directly. Others accused him of being too neutral. But Francis knew something deeper, that moral clarity sometimes comes not from accusation, but from intercession. In the Middle East, he pleaded for peace between Israel and Palestine, calling for a two-state solution and an end to the endless cycle of vengeance. In Myanmar, in Venezuela, in Syria, his voice cut through politics and into the conscience of nations. Not as a politician, as a prophet. Francis also led key synods on the family, on youth, and on the Amazon region. But one of his most audacious moves was the Synod on Synodality, a global listening process where for the first time, 10% of voting members were women. It was less about doctrine, more about dialogue. He wanted the church to not just preach, but to hear. This made enemies. Traditionalists called it chaos. Reformers said it wasn't enough. But Francis pressed on. He spoke not from a throne, but from a folding chair in village churches, refugee camps, and prisons. He didn't offer answers, he offered questions. Questions the church had long been afraid to ask. And people listened. From indigenous leaders to climate scientists, from war-torn communities to disenfranchised youth, he invited the voices the church had too often ignored. That synod is considered the culmination of Francis's work and the most important event in the Catholic Church this century. He knew the church had to evolve, not abandon tradition, but rediscover its heart. And in a time when the world's loudest voices were shouting for power, Francis whispered for peace. And somehow, that whisper still reached the world. Francis has called several synods or councils of bishops and lay people to debate church doctrine, including synods on the family, on youth, and on the church in the Amazon region. He convened the Synod on Synodality. For the first time in history, 10% of the voting attendees were women. They shared ideas and experiences and discussed the future direction of the church. This synod is considered the culmination of Francis's work and the most important event in the Catholic Church this century. It wasn't held in secrecy or behind marble walls. It was a synod with open microphones and open wounds. The Synod on Synodality wasn't just another meeting. It was an earthquake, an attempt to shake centuries of clericalism, silence, and patriarchy from the Church's foundation. Francis didn't just call bishops. He called laypeople, women, the marginalized, and the unheard. For the first time, women could vote in shaping the Church's future not as guests, but as equals. For some, it was a breath of grace. For others, heresy. Inside the Vatican, conservative factions called it a slow schism. Outside, progressive Catholics called it a miracle. But Francis knew this was the price of listening. He didn't promise immediate change. He promised a process, a church that walks together, not dictates from above. He believed the Holy Spirit speaks not just through mitres and vestments, but through mothers, migrants, nuns, and youth. The question wasn't what must we preserve, but whom have we ignored? The sessions were global, multilingual, and deeply raw. Survivors of abuse spoke. LGBTQ Catholics shared their pain. Women religious testified to their invisibility in church governance. And bishops, they were asked to listen, not lead. It was uncomfortable. It was beautiful. They discussed everything from married priests to female deacons, from inclusion to doctrine, from ecology to evangelization. Francis watched not as emperor, but as host. He insisted that the Church must learn to listen without judgment, to walk with its people, not ahead of them. This wasn't Vatican II all over again. It was something riskier, not a council of declarations, but of questions. Some feared this would fracture the Church. Francis hoped it would save it. Without dialogue, he said, we become a museum. But Christ is alive, and the Church must move. Still, the backlash was fierce. Anonymous letters circulated. Cardinals voiced dissent. Conservative media branded the synod as a gateway to moral relativism. But Francis stood firm, not because he wanted to change the Church, but because he wanted the Church to return to its roots, the radical listening and living of Christ himself. Whether the synod results in sweeping reforms or not, one thing is certain: it has already changed something fundamental. It has opened the doors. It has invited voices long locked out. It has made the Church uncomfortable in exactly the ways it needed to be. From 2022, Francis used a wheelchair after a knee operation. In February 2025, he was admitted to hospital in Rome for bronchitis. He developed a respiratory infection and bilateral pneumonia. He was further at risk because part of his lung had been removed in his youth. The Pope was placed on a ventilator. He recovered from the ordeal, and after over a month in hospital, he blessed the crowd below his window and was released to his home, Doma Sanctae Martha, where he was expected to recuperate for at least 2 months while maintaining a reduced work schedule. On April 20th, Easter Sunday, he blessed the crowd from the balcony and rode through St. Peter's Square. He also met U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance. Pope Francis died the following morning, April 20th, 2025 at 7:35 a.m. at his residence. He was 88. He had defied illness before, once with half a lung, once with an empty stomach, always with full devotion. But this time, even Francis knew his hour had come. The world had barely begun to breathe after Easter when the bells of St. Peter's tolled again. Not for celebration, for silence. The shepherd of the peripheries, the pope of the margins, had fallen asleep. His final weeks were filled not with pageantry, but quiet gestures, a window blessing, a ride through the square, a whispered joke to a nurse, a final nod to the poor. He lived as he reigned simply, humbly, relentlessly. Now that the papal throne is vacant, what happens next? When a pope dies, his passing is confirmed by a doctor and a ceremonial Vatican official who calls out his baptismal name 3 times. Hearing no response, the official will declare the pontiff dead and the papal office vacant. And so, as tradition demands, his fisherman's ring was broken, his papal apartment sealed, his body placed not in imperial splendor, but in simplicity, just as he asked. There would be no gold casket, no hidden power games, but there would be grief. True to form, Pope Francis chose to eliminate several elements of funerary pageantry in favor of a more simple ceremony. Rather than an elevated catafalque, his body was displayed in an open wooden coffin. And he will be the first pope in a century not to be interred in the splendor of the Vatican. Instead, he will be laid to rest in Santa Maria Maggiore Basilica in Rome. He had asked, once, not to be remembered with statues, but with actions. Not with marble, but with mercy. And so, his legacy remains not in relics, but in echoes, the prisoners whose feet he washed, the migrants whose cries he heard, the forests he defended, the walls he broke, the conversations he began, but would never finish. Now, the throne sits empty again. White smoke will rise once more. A new name will be chosen, but the weight of this papacy will linger long after the incense has faded. Because Francis was not just a pope, he was a shift in soul.